see a large nose or ears, there's nothing to worry about. He's just wanting to get attention at that point. Okay. So first things first, drugs, alcohol, and young people. When you mention drugs, people have a tendency to freak out. When you mention young people can often freak out. If you mention the two together, it can be almost like a toxic combination, and people really worry. I mean, but we will try in part of what we're saying to put things into context to try to reassure people around the situation. If sometimes I have to stop listening to the news and such like because it can become it's sort of one pointy sharp end of a situation and doesn't take into account the full spectrum of all of our young people. So I like to put this here. I found this image a little while ago, and I'm not sure what the person on the left is actually smoking. It looks like a roll of carpet, so that would probably be bad for your health. So not good. So the first things first, when we look at drugs, what is a drug? So when the National Treatment Agency that was back, which sort of taken over by Public Health, had said a drug is any substance that, when taken into the living organism, affects the central nervous system, thereby modifying physical and thought processes. That's a little bit wordy, but in essence, a drug goes into the system, and there's lots of different ways for drugs to go into the system. So we can name a few. So if we talk about like orally, so drinking, for example, swallowing and taking in that goes into the stomach and then goes in that way. You could snort substances. And that would be, snorting up into the nose, goes to the blood capillaries in the nose, into the bloodstream, and then that way, obviously, we've got smoking, which is a very quick way of getting a substance into the system. We then come into things like injecting. So injecting, which the adult service would see a much higher prevalence of than young people's, which I'm pleased with in some ways. Obviously, it'd be good if adults didn't see as much of that, but yeah. Now, in terms of injecting, there's many different ways that people can inject. Well, sort of three different ways. So the first way would be intravenous, so into a vein, and that's pretty direct. Obviously, there's a set of challenges that come from injecting. If you miss a vein and hit something else, that's probably not going to be good. Infections can travel around your body system because you're introducing potential bacteria and such like. So there's a range of problems. Injecting is one of the most dangerous ways of taking a substance. So another way is called intramuscular. So intramuscular is into a muscle mass. So that would be drugs like steroids, often are put direct into muscle mass. And so that's another way. And then the last way would be subcutaneous. So subcutaneous, also known as skin popping. So that would be under the layers of skin. So you would know that for things like people who have diabetes and might need to use like something like an EpiPen. That would be just underneath the skin, very small needle. We don't see that as much. Is that fair to say, Christy? In terms of adults, in terms of
Yeah, we don't
injecting,
see it very often at all.
but it's sort of to make you aware of it. So that's another way. Absorption. That's another way. So nicotine patches would be a good way of doing it. I used nicotine patches once and just couldn't see my cigarettes, so that worked quite well. So that was meant to be something where someone might smile or just think I'm fairly tragic. Okay, so that's the what is a drug. And then the National Treatment Agency also put a chemical substance which is developed and used for the prevention or treatment of disease. What we have to realize is a lot of substances actually sometimes have a medical benefit as well. Obviously, used under a medical practitioner's care and in a controlled way. But we know that there's the opiate family, for example, of which heroin is the one that you would be aware of. Well, the opiate family is incredibly useful in terms of the medical profession. So, for Christy, upcoming pethidine might come in handy during pregnancy and giving birth. But there are a range of different types of substances, and we will come on to those in a minute. So, who uses drugs? This is just an excuse for me to put panda here, really, because I love pandas. They're fantastic creatures. But there's a reason why I put this. So basically, everyone uses drugs. Feats is probably in an unaware kind of way, but we know that during pregnancy, if people use substances. There are certain substances that are more harmful than others, but certainly alcohol, heroin, when it comes to being pregnant, and if you're using them, that could have a significant impact on an unborn child. And certainly when you talk to those who have a young person or who have used heroin during pregnancy, one of the first things baby needs to do when they're born is withdraw from heroin. So what can often happen is if a baby is in that stage where what they should be getting is mothers, fathers, carers, warmth and comfort and feeling heartbeat and all those sort of things. If you've got cold, flu-like symptoms and feeling awful, and that's right at your start point in life, I wonder what that might do from that early childhood sort of perspective. Um, but yeah, children, young people, adults. Now, this is where I've realised I'm getting older. So a lot of our young people will say, well, one said the other day, "You're proper old, you are," and I said, "How old do you think you are?" I am, and he said, "I'm mid-60s." So so yeah, so I realise that I am getting older, and so I've psychologically put older people there just to slightly distance myself and make me feel slightly better. And then even animals. We share the same central nervous system as most animals. And as a result, actually, what we see in the animal kingdom is we can see drug use. So there's something about being alive that means changing one's concept of reality. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean drugs and alcohol. This also doesn't come from a place of condoning drugs and alcohol. I'm trying to be sort of, I suppose, dispassionate about it. But some animals will seek out substances. So one of my favorite types of animals is lemurs. I love them. I think they're amazing creatures. But there's a lemur called a black lemur. And what it's worked out is giant millipedes secrete a thing called a neurotoxin, which would either, make animals very sick or kill them. And so it puts animals off from eating them. But of course, a lemur has worked out that this neurotoxin has a very unusual effect. So what it does, and if you put in something like lemurs and drugs, obviously in an appropriate web place, and you might find something which is narrated by David Attenborough, and so there's this black lemur gets a little giant millipede, starts nibbling it, not in a harmful way to the millipede. The millipede secretes a neurotoxin as a defense. Lemur rubs it into its fur, and then lo and behold, 5 minutes later, the lemur is completely off its face and dribbling and hanging onto the tree. So at that point, David Attenborough says the scientists believe that this has an insecticidal property and that's why they do it. And I'm thinking, I'm not so sure. I think they might be getting a benefit out of this, a reward on some level. We have this part inside ourselves, which is about our reward system. It's very useful for survival, and it's connected to a whole load of brain chemicals. So, what drugs do is they don't necessarily add anything new, they trigger the stuff you've already got in your brain, the capacity that you have to feel different feelings. You're using neurotransmitters and receptors using different brain chemicals. One of note would be dopamine. So, interestingly, dopamine is also released when you eat sugar. So sugar has a similar kind of nature in some ways to certain substances. So we have this inbuilt part of us that that almost sort of can be triggered by substance misuse. Um, Throughout many, many generations, substance misuse has been very, very prevalent across civilization. I think as soon as civilization kind of was created, there was probably a drug that was connected to it. Alcohol goes back to about 12,000 BC. And in fact, one of the first known recipes that was discovered was for brewing beer. So we know which direction society was in at that point. So it seemed to work as a part of civilization. Also, some would argue that water was pretty minging back in the day and could make you very ill. So having some sort of type of beverage that had a content of alcohol in it would clean some of that water and make it, I suppose, more palatable to drink. So I know in some cases that would be the case. Alcohol also became fundamentally fused with religion at one point. So at one point, to despise alcohol was viewed as heresy. And we look at a lot of the sort of religious kind of ceremonies often involve alcohol as well. Going back to ancient times, things like Dionysus, a Greek goddess, which and there's a whole range that have sort of come forward, including to modern day times. Anyway, so why do young people use drugs? And this is one of the things that a lot of people sort of say. So what is it about it? And there's a whole range of different factors, but I've put them as just a few, just to kind of highlight. So it's that curiosity. The thing is, as human beings, we're quite curious. And so sometimes it is that part of wanting to find out what something's like. There could be a naivety that's attached to that, or an ignorance, or a lack of education, a lack of knowledge of consequence. And so there might be that sort of sense. Excitement. We can't rule out the fact that some drugs make affect people in different ways, and some drugs make people feel nice. If they didn't, people wouldn't do them. But of course, here's the thing: there's a downside to it. There's a bit of a kicker, and a consequence. And so, but we know that drugs that make people feel nice, they often do that. If you've got something where you have an underlying kind of challenge or difficulty, then you could see why some might seek out a substance as a way of coping with that. We know, for example, there's a lot of connection between trauma and early childhood trauma and childhood experience, and more likelihood in substance misuse as well. And that part of that is what I would call acopic. So using as a coping strategy, as a way of dealing with things. So we have a lot of our young people who come to us with neurodiversity or neurodivergent challenges, things like autism, ADHD. And for some of our young people, there's an element that they're trying to find a way of regulating the more challenging aspects of their neurodiversity. It doesn't mean that it's right, it doesn't mean that it works, but from a human's perspective, we often try to do things and try to solve problems ourselves, and can seek out some very unusual ways of adapting and coping. So that's another thing. So they're wanting to fit in. We're all tribal creatures by nature, and so we want to feel part of a something. And if you imagine very vulnerable young people who might not have too many friends, who might feel socially excluded, who might not be attaining well in education, there might be a range of other kind of reasons, they might want to become a part of something. And if that part of something is involving substances, then that might mean that they sort of head in that direction. Coming of age, I've put this because in the many, many years I've worked with WiseSmart, when it comes to a young person turning 18 and alcohol, there's a very unusual thing that happens when so young people believe, I think it's slightly changing nowadays, but historically, certainly, young people believed that alcohol was almost like a inherent right to use once you get to 18. And so you'd say, well, what are you doing for your 18th birthday? I'm going to go out and get completely bladdered. And when we would ask questions like, well, why? They look at you as if you're kind of like an alien, coming up with a very unusual concept of why would you choose to do that. So coming of age, that rite of passage can be something. It can also be connected to certain other substances as well. So where the Misuse of Drugs Act, where the police would come in, where our criminal justice partners would come in, they would be working on the availability of a substance. Because quite frankly, if a substance isn't available, no one can take it. So the Misuse of Drugs Act looks to target availability by taking out dealers and importers and all of those people. But there's a big challenge in that when the police go in and they raid places, they'll take out substances, and maybe dealers, and then it seems to be backfilled by other people. And there's something about demand versus availability. So if there's a I'll say need very loosely. If there's a need for substances, then there will always be someone there to fulfill that need, and particularly where money is available and there. But that's where we try to work on, because if there it isn't there, they can't use it. But of course, what in a global community, the availability of substances is going up and up, and various different forms of technology, including things like the dark web and such like, mean that people can access things that maybe they couldn't have historically. So that is changing the landscape somewhat around substances. So the other one is reduction of pain and suffering. I've sort of alluded to that with the acopic use, so using as a coping strategy. If you have an internal pain or you have an internal feeling, then there might be a want to change that. Dependency. So we would look at addiction here. So there's two different real types of addiction. So we would say physical and psychological. So, a physical addiction is a classical addiction. If you stop using the drug after taking it for a period of time, if you stop using it, you're going to get an adverse physical reaction. You're going to get not feel very good on the lowest level, or you might get really ill. Now, in the short term, our brains are wired for short-term fix, short-term reward, and so in the short term, our brains almost say, "Well, there must be a solution." We're constantly bombarded with. I think over Christmas, there was an advert which was saying, "Keep going over Christmas, take Pro Plus." So when actually maybe Christmas is a time to relax, and maybe Christmas is a time to just kind of take that space. But there is that sense of, so drugs are actually prevalent, whether they're illicit or otherwise, all around us, in various different ways. And there does seem to be an adage of, if there's something wrong, there's a pill that will sort that right out. So that yeah, reduction, that so physical is that adverse kind of reaction trying to use it. But of course, every one of us are also psychological beings. So some would argue that the psychological bit of an addiction, the feeling like you need to use it, the wanting to use it, the that might be actually harder to overcome than the physical bit. We have lots of medications and bits we can do for physical addiction, but they're often left with all the triggers, all the reasons why they've used in the first place. So the old model where you would send someone off to rehab, and then they come back all fixed, and then they come into the community and it's all fabulous. That doesn't necessarily happen. So it can do, but people need a lot of support when they come back into the community, because when they come back into the community, they're faced with a lot of the reasons why they used in the first place. And as you may have found in yourselves in various different ways, if you want to make change in your life, I mean, me, I eat too much, but when I go on holiday, I have this thing that happens, and then I sort of eat a lot less. I'm not around the places where I would normally get triggered, and normally have those kind of associations with I suppose my addiction to sugar and food and such like. So yeah, so that psychological bit, and I often describe it as a bit like the inner spoilt child. So if you imagine that spoilt child that I'm sure you've seen in a supermarket, and the child's like, "I want that," and the mum's like, "You're not having that." And the child, being relatively intelligent, says, "Look, mum, if I can't be held responsible for my actions should you decide to not give me that item," and the mum's like, "Don't you hold me to ransom," and but then if the child gets what they want, they have that frustrating, sort of smug kind of sensation look over their face. But what it does, it sets a little sort of pathway. And then the next time they ask, there will be an expectation. And so that, and then what happens if they don't get what they want? Well, I mean, my children, I've got three children, and I don't know if you've ever experienced a child dead waiting, where they just sort of flop down and you try to pick them up. Now, I'm relatively strong, but I cannot pick up a child who is dead weighting very easily. So I think science needs to possibly study that. Maybe we've got some sort of anti-gravitational device or something connected. Um, but of course, that that sort of almost temper tantrum is what our brains can internally do and make it seem like the only answer is to use that substance. And of course, like the child getting what they want and going, now it's almost like your body and your brain kind of do that similar kind of thing. So I don't know if you guys know Terry Pratchett, who a very famous author. He came up with a theory, and he said that in a world full of wonder, creativity, and inspiration, only humans could create a concept such as boredom. And it does always amaze me that we do get tend to get bored. And what a lot of young people will say is I'm bored. Now, what that can sometimes mean is lots of other things underneath that. But that kind of, oh, I'm bored, so I'm doing something to fill my time. It could be a factor as well. There's many other factors there, and I could go on for a long time about them. But of course, they're the sort of main bits in terms of why that young person would start to use that substance. When we then move in our sort of terms, we would look at use in two different ways, but National Treatment Agency or Public Health would look at it in three separate ways, and I'll explain the difference with young people services. So experimental drug use, that kind of early seeing how something is, seeing what the effect is like, gaining that new experience, not obviously problematic or harmful at that stage, but it's that kind of trying it. So that would be classified as experimental. Recreational, again, like it says here, is more a pattern. So it might be someone going out and drinking of a weekend, but again, it seems to sit in terms of their life. They don't seem to be having significant consequence in that circumstance. But again, there's a pattern and there's something to monitor and think about in terms of increase or such like. And then problematic when taking it results in severe social and health consequences. So that real kind of far end of that substance misuse. Now, in young people services, we tend to use a slightly different way of describing it. So we will use use versus misuse. Now, there's a reason for this because young people often haven't had the amount of time using a substance to get to that really severely problematic level. We do get the odd ones and twos here and there, but the vast majority of our young people are at that earlier stage and need that kind of earlier intervention and earlier approach to try to prevent escalation, to try to prevent and encourage better values and better ways of thinking about things and possibly better coping strategies and such like. So we would use that use versus misuse. It's really quite hard to define in terms of one person's use over another's, but age can come into that. So a very young person accessing substances, which would be slightly unusual, that could well be misuse in itself. Those who it's having an overall impact on their overall life functioning. So, for example, school is suffering if they're going to school, so their educational attainment, maybe aspiration is down, maybe there's a whole set of other kind of challenges. Maybe their emotional regulation is being affected, so they dysregulate very quickly. And then if we add things like neurodiversity or neurodivergent condition to that, then it becomes sort of a slightly challenging. Okay, are we all okay still? Because I realise that I'm just sort of going on. Um,
Absolutely.
okay,
Yeah,
we're
all good.
going.
No questions either to
Oh,
pick up at
now
the
that
end.
either means everyone has fallen asleep, or that
Mhm.
means that
We're
it's all
getting
good.
thumbs up, Simon. You're okay. I do have a hand up at the moment.
Good.
Oh yeah, we do actually have a hand up.
Oh, fantastic.
Um,
So I can see a G there.
Glenda,
yeah,
did you want to speak?
Or is that one till the end?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I
Yes.
can. Hello.
Hi. What I wondered, if a child is born with symptoms, withdrawal from drugs,
Yeah.
heroin, are they more likely in later years and seeing mum as they grow up taking that heroin, are they more likely to sway towards drugs?
Oh, that's an interesting question. This one is hotly debated. And I suppose the simplest way of answering it is we are a complex mix of nature and nurture. So I think in that scenario that you're explaining, we there might be a biological kind of bit connected to mum's previous heroin use and then the withdrawal and that kind of jumping across. But of course, you need then the other stuff to go with it to create that. Because almost otherwise, you would be saying, well, every single person would predispose to go through that. And we know that's not necessarily the case. But we know that
Yeah.
that biological aspect can be a vulnerability factor in itself. But I
Hmm.
would say also if they're in that environment, which might be unvalidated. When I say stuff about parents as well, I need to be very, very clear that the vast majority of parents want to parent well, and the vast majority of parents want to do the right thing. Addiction can sometimes arch that, and can have a lot of impact on that intent.
Yeah.
But so I'm not here to bash parents, and I'm not here to have a go
No,
because
no. These children have been taken off their parents
yeah,
because of this, because it was escalating over a number of years, stopped, escalated.
yeah,
So yeah, they're now living with me. But I just wondered, if drugs is everywhere at the moment, isn't it? More so than I think it's been in a long time with youngsters, especially. I don't know, you just seem to hear about it more.
mhm,
And I just wondered whether there would be this vulnerability of what they've witnessed, and even
yeah.
being born with that withdrawal,
Yeah,
whether there would be, something there that would
yeah,
draw them
I,
back.
I think it's a complex mix. But yes, absolutely. If you're in that, and I think it says it there actually. So those young people whose lives have been chaotic would result in involvement with social services. Obviously, I have to say that social services does not cause drug use in itself. But yeah, often there is a set of things. I mean, if you looked at it just purely from a perspective of when a person is totally intoxicated, and particularly if we're looking at opiates, are they able to parent in that moment when they're very, very intoxicated? And I would argue they're probably not, or certainly not to the level that they would if they weren't intoxicated. Um, so that in itself could impact. Obviously, if you've got young person, I've had person I worked with heroin using parents, and she often would get up and they would be intoxicated, so often to her looking like they were asleep on the sofa. So she had needs, and what she did was she nearly burnt the house down. She poured sugar into a toaster because she felt that that was the where food comes from. And so, and with that lack of parental supervision, that didn't help the situation. In some cases, we have that kind of chaos of lots of random adults coming in and out of houses. If parents are involved in supply of substances, then that makes it even more worrying and concerning. So yeah, so the whole kind of gamut of everything can create, and that trauma, not having your needs met. So all of these kind of basic bits of early childhood and childhood going through sometimes aren't met. So yeah, so it would create that scenario. So, linked to that, also, we often talk about social economic deprivation. So, those socially deprived areas, of which Devon has a number of areas across the county that are very, very socially deprived. And if you look at the national index, we kind of an outlier in certain areas for that social deprivation. But of course, within social deprivation, that doesn't suggest that affluence, that people who have a lot of money and resource won't get into drugs and alcohol problems. But there is a slight challenge. So if you're in a deprived area, you don't have a lot of resource, and you start misusing substances, then you've got to try and sustain that on some sort of level, particularly if we talk about addiction and such like. So how do you sustain it? Well, you could head down a route of dealing and then using in essence the profits, and then using them yourself. You might look to go and start committing some sort of crime to fund your thing. And so what actually happens in those circumstances, you'll come to the attention of services fairly quickly. So often when we look at stats, it will see a huge uplift in social and economic deprivation. Um, and but it almost hides the fact that affluent areas also have significant substance misuse issues. That's, I suppose, the point that I'm making. Because and also with affluent areas, often the family resource, the financial resource can hold the issue without it hitting services for far longer. So statistically, it wouldn't then show up. But if you're in a deprived area and you've got someone driving around, I know in the Barnstable area we had a person driving around with BMW that had drug boy written on the thing. So I just think that would make him a target for the police. But that was there. But of course, had a lot of money and a lot of resource. Now, for some of our very vulnerable young people, that might be attractive. That might be something that could be aspired to. There might be a sense of identity that comes with it. And I know certainly for some of our extremely vulnerable young people who've got caught up in dealing and in that world, often there is an exploitative realm to that as well. But they'll often get that sort of sense of identity off of that. Not the right one, but they'll get that sense of power as well. And that can be very, very difficult to work with. So young offenders connected to that as well. So those committing crimes, bit chicken and egg, which one came first? But we know there is an association. As Y-Smart, we are co-located with the Youth Justice Service in Barnstable and in South, and we're there for a reason. About 30% of our referrals come via the criminal justice route. So poor emotional health. So those people struggling with emotional regulation, struggling with that sort of their mental health sometimes can also lead to substance misuse. Some of our young people have chronic problems sleeping, and some will try to seek out an illicit substance to help them with sleeping. But of course, here's the thing: in many cases, it might in the short term help, but in the long term make the situation worse. So those truanting excluded young people. Exclusion, something that we look at a lot, because if being tribal creatures, we have this sort of sense of identity, a sense of want to belong to a something. And what happens if society excludes us, if our other friend groups exclude us, if families exclude us? Those feelings of exclusion can be incredibly powerful. And also, just on a purely practical level, if you're a young person who is excluded from school, for example, you're out and about, then there's a good chance that you're going to be hanging around with older peers and older people who might be either out of school themselves or might be beyond that level. So, of course, developmentally, you might be associating with those who are older and have a different point in their life. So we know that exclusion can be a real part and a real factor. Young people not attaining education. I don't mean academic attainment, because as we know, it takes a huge number of spokes to make a wheel. And so everyone has a part to play in that. But it's that sense of, I would probably boil it down to aspiration or lack of aspiration, and we talk to as many of our very vulnerable young people, what do you want to do in the future? What are you thinking about? And they often have absolutely no idea. Sometimes society invalidates them as well and creates a pathway that they feel is almost helpless around that. So you can see why in some cases some people might choose to seek out a substance. It doesn't make it right, and I do not condone it, but you could see the potential connection. Homeless young people. I cannot imagine what it would be like to be homeless. I mean, I'm a fisherman. I love fishing, and the good bit about that is I get to go home after being wet and cold and miserable. Whereas the one thing we know about Devon is it has a lot of rain. That's why it's so green and wonderful. But when you talk to the homeless community, you'll often hear them say, they can deal with hot, they can deal with cold. The one thing they cannot deal with is wet. And you guys probably know that yourselves. If you've ever got wet, how on earth do you get warm again and such like? If you're living on the street, I could see why people might seek out a substance. Doesn't make it right, but I could see why they might, to try and block that out, to try and cover it. Okay. I'll put a little bit of honest there. So reasons for drinking emphasize coping with traumatic life. There is a huge association with alcohol and coping, alcohol and trauma, alcohol and domestic violence. I think it's, Christy, you might know this stat. Is it about 70% of domestic violence related incidents have alcohol as a component part? I think it's something, it's a very high stat anyway.
I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah, I'm not sure
So
about
we
the
know
exacts,
there's
but
an
I wouldn't be surprised.
association. But we know there's an association with trying to cover stuff up. The nature of how alcohol works is I would say it sort of acts like a psychic glue. It sort of holds someone, but it doesn't deal with anything. And that's the issue. Because, of course, then when the person then decides, they might decide they're going to come off alcohol, they're not just coming off the drug, they've also got the reasons why they were using it in the first place will all start to bubble up as well. And so if it's a very extreme level of trauma, sexual abuse, physical abuse, a whole range of other kind of real significant challenges, then that is going to raise to the surface. So you can see why for some people it's not just as simple as just say no. It's not just as simple as I'm going to stop. There's a whole range of kind of challenges around that. I'm not going to hang on this too long. Statistics are what they are, but I suppose the main headlines is there are roughly around 332,000 problem drug users in England. It's quite a lot in it. And actually, if we look at those young people impacted on it, we're looking at around about, and just parental substance misuse and the impact, we're looking at between 332,000 to anywhere up to about 750,000 young children are impacted on by parental substance misuse. I'll talk about that in a second when we look at the hidden harm. But we also know it's worth a lot of money. That's why a lot of people take a lot of risk. So the illicit market is worth 4 billion to 6.6 billion. And here's the interesting bit. So Class A drug use generates an estimated 15.4 billion in crime costs. And then 99% of that is accounted for by the 332,000 problem drug users. So why on earth are we not really funding drugs and alcohol more? I'm not saying that as a political thing. It's just very interesting that substance misuse historically has often been seen as a poorer relation to many other things. But when we look at it in the main and its connection with mental health, its connection with social depravity, its connection with criminality, substance misuse is an underpinning kind of aspect of that. So there's some bigger headlines around young people, and what I want to say is the vast majority of young people don't use drugs and alcohol. The vast majority. When we tend to sort of look at the media, they would suggest everyone is now using ketamine. Well, we know there is an upswing, certainly in the ages of 18 to 24 in ketamine, and our service see them at the sort of at last end of that. But substances go in waves. So what you'll often find is we'll have common substances with young people that are fairly consistent. So our common ones would be alcohol, cannabis, and probably still nicotine. I say nicotine now rather than tobacco because it's shifting into vaping now more than smoking cigarettes, and that's a newer realm that the system is trying to get to grips with. So we'll be sort of looking at that as well. Hopefully you'll get a printout of this so you can have a look at these stats, but stats are what they are. We're working a lot with a lot of young people, but we also know that what we do works. The bottom stat, so 2009, it's very difficult to get many studies, more modern studies, but a survey in schools found 3/5 of 11 to 15-year-olds recalled the lessons about drugs and alcohol in school, and 95% said they helped them think about risk. So, and then 80% said it helped them to avoid drugs altogether. So we look at what does prevention do, and about being honest with our young people, because there is a concern that what happens if we introduce drugs and alcohol to young people? They might then start using them because we're talking about them. It's a similar argument to sexual health and actually providing good quality sexual health interventions with young people and education. We know that helps young people to make better choices. And I suppose thinking about yourselves, most human beings don't want to harm themselves. So most people would not want to put themselves in a place where they would be causing themselves significant harm. They're often using drugs, as we've discussed, for many, many different reasons. And so sometimes for some of our young people, that message of the consequence, be it for them biologically, be it for them in a criminal way, be it for them psychologically, or for their own life chances, then that sometimes for some of us can make a difference. But as a service, we more often than not, when we work within treatment, we're working at the small section of the pyramid, if you like. That those young people who will not come out of substance misuse unharmed. They will come out with some sort of harm happening to them, and so we work with them. But not to be too controversial, but the vast majority of young people, even if they experiment, will come out the other end relatively unscathed. So I want to say that not because I'm condoning, not because but what I'm saying is we panic a lot. And sometimes it's about taking that breath. And as a parent, I know the place of panic. I know the place of one of my children has autism, so there is a sense of handing my child to another professional sometimes so he can get that support and encouragement, and that can feel very difficult. Also, at a time when they're having a confidential service. So of course the parent bit of me wants to know everything. But of course, I have to accept that sometimes I need to hand on to professionals and hand my child onto them, knowing that they will, try their best to help. So that will come into context of something I'll say in a minute. Okay, we all still happy? All still with us?
Absolutely.
Good, good. Okay, so drugs and their effects. Now, I could spend days listing off substances and talking about all the different bits and pieces. Drug workers find that fantastic. That's why we do what we do, I suppose. However, I'll give you a sort of, I suppose, a bit of a cheat method, a quick method of trying to work out where things are at. So in Y Smart, we certainly use the concept of stimulants, depressants, hallucinogens, and painkillers as a way of classifying drugs. There are many more complicated ways of doing it. There's a drug wheel by a guy called Mark Adley. If any of you are extremely biologically natured and love the thought of drugs and alcohol, or want to go into a career in our field, then that might be for you. But he would talk about dissociatives, entheogens, and a whole range of others. But for the sake of simplicity, and what I found works over many, many years, is this sort of description. So a stimulant speeds up the central nervous system, and speeds up the heart rate, and so that would be things like amphetamines. So speed, as we know it, cocaine can come into that. So things that kind of are up, they can be activating in their nature. Caffeine could sit into a stimulant category because, of course, when you're feeling a bit sort of rubbish, like me this morning, I had a coffee, perked me up. Of course, then, as we know, with it, we go up and then we plateau and then we come back down again, with substances. So I will probably be needing a coffee shortly after. And I say need very loosely because it's probably bad for me to say that. So I would want a coffee later. So stimulants, that kind of up. Depressants, the opposite, kind of down. So one of the classical depressants would be alcohol. So alcohol is a central nervous system depressant, slows down the central nervous system, releases a whole load of interesting brain chemicals. But I suppose if you've ever tried, I'm sure some of you may have drunk, and I'm sure some of you may have got to a point of intoxication. And so if you've ever tried to put a key in a lock when under the influence of alcohol, the messages from your brain are saying key in lock. I've done this thousands of times, but for some reason, your hand is not working in accordance with where your brain is at. And so that kind of impact on motor function, you see it of a Friday, Saturday night in some of our town centres, people walking around looking fairly inebriated, not in control of their proclivities. And so so alcohol is a significant sort of depressant. There are a few others as well, but for the sake of argument, what I'd say is if you want more information on drugs and alcohol, have a look at Talk to Frank, which is a really good website. It's got an A to Z of drugs that's actually still really good, and it's still very much updated. So if you want to go into the real fine, minute detail of this, then have a look at that. So hallucinogens, they change perception, the way of seeing things, hearing things, experiencing life. So often you would get things like cannabis would sit as a hallucinogen, but here's the thing: cannabis also sits as a stimulant, depressant, and partially a painkiller. It's a very fascinating substance. I could talk for a long time about cannabis. It fascinates me as a substance, and as an entity, cannabis has been around for about 5,000, since about 5,000 BC, and its path was used really as a medical entity back about 5,000 BC, where it was traded along the Shenzhen mountain chain in China, Kazakhstan, all around that kind of way as a plant that kind of frequents that area. Um, So that's hallucinogens. So things like LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide, magic mushrooms. So things that change perception. We also hear of things called DMT, so deoxymethyltryptamide. That's often called a businessman's trip, and it comes from a vine, an Amazonian vine or a South American vine called ayahuasca. So some of you might have heard of ayahuasca. It's used culturally for sort of shamanic practices in sort of South America, but has been brought across to us as well. And then painkillers. So those does what it says on the till on the tin really. Painkillers, they will often release things like endorphins, natural pain blockers. So I suppose the classical painkillers would be opiates and the opiate family. So all of the connections between heroin, pethidine, diamorphine, codeine, and a whole range of others with the Ean name on the end. So yeah, and many of you may well have used those. Very, very useful substances, but they do have a downside. And we have people who've legitimately, and certainly Christy would attest to in the adult services, you'll often get people who have an addiction to opiates, but it hasn't come from, say, an illicit market. It's come from a medical route. They might have had significant trauma, an accident where, I don't know, they've detached their colon or something, I don't know. And then they've had opiates as a way to manage pain legitimately under a medical professional's care, but unfortunately they've got stuck with an addiction. So what we can see is, if we look at who's a typical drug user, it's very difficult to classify that because there are so many. If we talk about steroid use, those who are performance enhancing, they might access needle exchange, for example, in adult services and say for needles to do their stuff. But it's very peculiar because you have a classical, I suppose, stereotypical opiate user versus someone coming in who's entirely in a different way accessing the same service but for different purposes. So drug use goes across all stratas of civilization and society. So there isn't really that one thing. I would love, because loads of people say, what's the one thing? What's the one thing I need to look out for? And I suppose if I was going to boil it down, it's change. So what you're looking at in the young person is your young people. And so when something will change negatively. And then it's about asking the question, because it might not be substance misuse, it might be something else, but it's about having that openness to say, I've noticed a change and I'm worried, and how can I help you, how can I support you? Okay, so now that would make sense, stimulants, depressants, hallucinogens, and painkillers, if we didn't add a human being to it. And this is where it gets slightly more complicated, because humans respond in all sorts of different ways. I'm sure if we go back to alcohol again, because it's the easiest analogy, if you have friends who use alcohol, you might have them all use the same sort of alcohol, but all respond in entirely different ways. I had a friend who always used to lose her bag, and then that was a moment to take her home. When you notice that, because their cognitive functioning was sort of going down. We get happy drunks, so to speak. We get people who are more likely to dysregulate and be a bit aggressive. So that you can have the one substance, but it can affect everyone in an entirely different way. So the way I look at this is we use a thing called substance set and setting. We use this with young people. It's very, very effective. And so basically, the effect of a substance is related to three different factors. The first one is the substance itself. What is that substance? Is it indeed the substance you believe it is? Because we know in the illicit market, what you think a substance might be might not actually be that substance. It could be added to. When money is involved, people will cut all sorts of different corners and they will do all sorts of different things to make more money. And so when we try to place integrity with the illicit market, that's a very dangerous place to be around that. But yeah, so that's substance. The set would be themselves, their biology. So have they used that substance before? In many cases, for many substances, really apart from solvents, the more you use, the more you need to use to get the same effect. Or actually, you need to cut your use, bring it right down, and then your tolerance. So this is what we're talking about, is tolerance. So the more you use, your more your tolerance goes up to that substance. And unfortunately for many of our young people, they sort of almost like chase that. So they get to the point where they want to still have that level of intoxication, but start using more and more and more to try to get to that same point, when actually what they need to do is break, stop, and bring it right the way back to allow their body system to bring itself back to equilibrium, I suppose. So if they've got a tolerance-like effect on a substance, then that would impact on their experience on that substance. Have they used it before? Is it a new drug? How are they feeling? Certain hallucinogens, if they're in a very insecure place where they're using them, they're much more likely to have a negative experience in that circumstance. So actually, in terms of how they're feeling, can be a big trigger as well. And then the last one is the setting. It's the everything else. It's the everywhere else. So Christy alluded earlier to her career, her early career in the prison. So what we know of people who come out of prison who had a very entrenched drug problem is that sometimes, and again, I'm speaking naively that there isn't drugs in prisons, but if, for instance, we take that they haven't used when they're in prison and they come out and they decide to use, they might decide to use the same amount of drug that they had when they went into prison. There's a problem, and the problem is their tolerance level has come right the way down. So they will get much more effect out of what they're using, and in effect could actually overdose as well. So when people and professionals are planning on people to come out of prison and out of custodial facilities, there's often a transitionary plan that goes in place to try to encourage them not to do that. And yeah. So that's substance, set, and setting, and those three factors affect on what they're doing. So it's not just as simple as they're using this. And then conditioning also plays that part. So we learn and we can condition ourselves in certain ways around that. Again, all of these things are available out. If you look on the Frank website, there is a range of other sort of websites out there that might be able to help you. And if you want to go into a little bit more depth around these bits and pieces, we've also got a website together. I have a website as well, which will assist you, and we can put those in later. Okay, how am I doing for time, by the way?
It's 11 o'clock, but you can keep on going because people are still here listening. So
Okay,
keep
so
going.
if suddenly I realise I'm talking to myself, then yeah, it's not gone too well. Okay, so wherever there is a vulnerability factor, there's also a protective factor, because as humans we want to know, well, what can we do? What do the young people need to help them? So the way I look at this is, if you imagine a house, and in our terms of global warming, or in our case in Devon, global flooding, because we just seem to get more and more wet, then we need houses on stilts. So if the house represents the person, the stilts represent their foundations. So if, for instance, their foundation is a drug, as we've talked about earlier, with using as a coping strategy, as a way of dealing with things, and then you just remove the drug, then the house is going to fall down. So it's about putting in that scaffold around it, so that when you remove the drug, or when you work on getting rid of that drug, then then you've got the support to hold that building still up. And also, in some ways, it also can help you to make that drug less prominent and less important to the individual. So we would look at temperament, positive temperament, intellectual ability. So someone being able to understand what's happening to them. So that obviously comes in with neurodiversity and neurodivergent sort of challenge around that, and how much do people understand, and how much do we put in that to enable people to understand. Supportive family environment. Family is incredibly important. What we know is, where family, carers, extended families work well together, we get far better outcomes for young people. But we also know the other side of it, where when a family is not working well together, that can create some very bad outcomes for young people as well. So it's sort of double-edged, but we try, where possible, to try to encourage young people to work with their parents, and try to encourage that sort of positivity. So external support systems that encourage positive values. It could be a range of clubs, other activities, other groups, things for people to engage in, that encourage them to look at things in a different way. Um, and a caring relationship. So this is where the evidence suggests it only needs to be one person. But here's the thing: if you are that person, good luck, because some of our very vulnerable young people will absolutely push you to the edge with because what a lot of very vulnerable young people feel is very unsafe. And if they're feeling very unsafe, the one thing I know about over the last 25 years is about the need for boundaries, consistency, wrapped up with love and kindness. But that boundary and consistency is so important. When we have very vulnerable young people, they will push and push and push and push because what they're looking for is where is our line? Where are we drawing that line in the sand around our boundaries? And they're looking for us to be consistent because we need to help to hold them. And once they know that, they often then feel much safer. But if you're on the receiving end of that, that can feel very bad. So anyone who works within the care profession, within care homes and such like, or foster caring, it's very challenging when you've got a very vulnerable young person who's had a huge trauma history in terms of that. But it is that boundary consistency. Targeted intervention. So that's where we start to look at what is the challenge and where do we go in. So as a service, we will go into a range of education establishments across the county, and we will deliver a whole set of bits of education. So we have an education team that will do that. We also work with those out of mainstream education provisions. So things like in North, we've got Wave Academy Trust. There's the Stansfield down in Exeter. I can't remember the one down in South. Sorry, Christy, that's really bad. I should remember where that's at. But there's a range of alternative provisions. And by their nature, that often means young people who haven't been able to cope in mainstream settings. So that makes them more vulnerable as well. So we will do a lot of education, harm reduction. So harm reduction is how can you do what you do safer? Now, this is often misinterpreted as condonement of drugs. It's not. But it's a recognition that if I say to some of our young people, don't do that, there's a good chance they're going to tell us where to stick that particular comment at that point. Whereas if we get alongside them and start to help them to see where risk is and to see that there's something, then that's a start point of a conversation. If you like, it starts to open a door to then starting to have those more challenging conversations around where they're at. But harm reduction is a really useful thing.
Quick question, Simon.
Oh, yes. Sorry.
Quick question in the chat. Is there a slide for all of this information that you're talking about right now? Because people are writing this down.
Yes, the trouble is I tend to sort of go around the edges of everything. Tend to bullet point things and then talk around the edges of it. But
We're
yeah,
still on the drugs and their effects slide at the moment. Is there a slide after that around protective factors?
Oh, I thought I was sharing that because wait a minute.
I'm not, unless it's maybe frozen.
Is yours frozen? Because I'm on protective factors.
You haven't got that. No, I've got drugs and their effects. Maybe stop sharing and reshare.
Weird. Okay, sorry.
We've got drugs and their effects.
That's really strange.
You've frozen
Stop
now.
sharing. Yeah, he's completely frozen.
Now he's cut out
Come
entirely.
back, Simon. Don't leave us at this point. This is the bit we want.
I'm sure he'll be back in a moment.
He will, yeah. Bear with us, people. I'm just gonna. I will remove him and ask him to rejoin, and then we might get somewhere. Now he's probably panicking, going, "Oh my God, I've lost everything." But give me a minute. I'll ask him to rejoin. The joys of technology.
There is no joy in technology.
I can't say I disagree. Whilst Simon is hopefully rejoining us, I have put a link in the chat to an evaluation survey afterwards. If people can fill that in, honestly, that would be really helpful. Christy, I was just looking for a link to see if there's a web link for Together Drugs and Alcohol, but
I can pop a link in there
that'd
now.
be great, thank you.
Yeah.
I can't find out how to add Simon back in.
I'm just doing it now. I'm able to request him to join.
Thank you. I was just sending him a quick message.
See if it works.
Fingers crossed. I suspect he's got internet problems or the like, and he will be back with us, I promise. We'll just give it a few minutes. So someone's asked in the chat about recommendation or literature or website written for teenagers. So the web link I put in the chat, the email that I put in the chat earlier, if you email me, I will link you to the Let's Talk. Oh, it looks like Simon's back. I'll link you to the Let's Talk website, and the Let's Talk is started as Let's Talk Teenagers. It's got a host of information on there. So, like I say, just email me. I'll put you in touch with the Let's Talk website that will be launched in March, and the web Let's Talk links. Simon, does that mean you're back?
Simon has said that
it won't
let him back in, but he's logging off and back in again. So just another couple minutes.
I did see, because I saw a message ping up Simon, and I thought, I don't know where I saw that.
Yeah, he's just gonna try.
For those that do leave us, because you've got other appointments and the such, like, I will be sending a recording out after this meeting, and I'll just cut out this middle bit where we're waiting for Simon.
It's clever that you can do that. I didn't know you could do that.
Neither did I until I started experimenting with the Let's Talk videos.
Oh, ideal.
I'll pop a link to our Let's Talk YouTube in the chat, and there's a variety of videos on there about a host of different subjects. It was quite good that Simon actually recommended Let's Talk, Talk to Frank, because we recommend that in the Let's Talk program as well. Talk to Frank is a really great resource for anyone regarding drugs and the like, especially if you don't know much about it, which I didn't.
It's always up to date as well.
Absolutely.
It doesn't sort of go outdated.
And that's why we link to their website, because they update it and we don't have to then update ours.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hi, Simon. Yay! You've come back to us.
One of those moments where you really panic, and I
Don't
had
worry,
one of those.
I was waffling away. It
Oh,
was all
I'm so
great.
glad. I've never had that happen before on Teams. It just said you're leaving and just logged me out.
Well, you'd completely frozen.
Yeah.
And your presentation had completely frozen, and we left it for a bit, and then I just kicked you out in the hope that you'd rejoin and it would work again.
Yes. So I've re-logged on, and I'm just
gonna reshare and restart from. And only a few people have had to leave, so don't worry. We've still got 34 on the call.
Oh, that's fantastic! Thank you so much for bearing with me, because I know this is.
Don't
such
start
a huge
from the beginning, though.
No, don't start.
Oh, I'm definitely not. No, definitely not going to do that. Right. Let's see where we're at. Oh God. Okay. I've just. Right. I'm trying it a very slightly different way. To see. Can we see that one?
We can see the first page. Yeah.
Okay. Right. Let's go through.
Types, vulnerability, what we know. Keep going. There we are. Protective
Hooray!
factors.
Thank you for bearing with me. As you can tell, I'm so not tech. So okay, and hopefully Christy was keeping you company whilst whilst I was off as well. So yeah, so we know that those targeted approaches can really help young people around harm reduction and such like. So yeah, and think about that kind of analogy of the house. Now to link to that, we've got a thing which is called the Resilience Framework. There's a project in Brighton called the Boing Boing Project, fairly rubbish name, but it basically means bounce back. And so it's about how to create resilience in young people. Now, resilience is a you'll see more and more chucked around the place because it's about how can you create a young person. We know that stuff happens in life. We know that there are certain people who seem to be more resilient around that and seem to be able to roll with challenge and roll with resistance much more than others. Whereas others it will completely floor them, and but some will seem to thrive in that kind of environment. So what Blinko has tried to do is look at all those reasons that could help to underpin resilience. And I've put it here because a lot of those concepts are universal and go across substance misuse, mental health, and a whole range of other bits and pieces. There's my favourite bit, and you have a read of this yourselves when you have a look at the slides. But there's a bit about putting on rose-tinted glasses. I really like that as a concept. Sometimes life can seem very harsh, but sometimes we can sort of sugarcoat our way of perceiving aspects of it. It's that kind of trying to see that positive note. We would use that in our approach when we use things like motivational interviewing with young people. You might get a young person who's very traumatized, not really wanting to be there, and as part of the approach, you're looking for the one good thing that's happened during that session. And it might just be, well, you're here and you've listened to me. You've sworn at me a bit, but you have listened to me quite a lot. And so it's about how we can put that perspective on things. Okay. Are we on to the next one? Can you see that slide? Yep, possibly.
Yep.
Good. So I've put a little bit of young minds here. What do they say about resilience? So again, it's that one trusted adult, the preparedness, capacity to learn. So it's learning those basic skills of dealing with things. Making sure young vulnerable people access activities. Now, activities are really, really important. Clubs, things that we would call them positive diversionary activities. So those things that give them a different set of values. And if you remember right at the start, we talked about that. And then it might mean that a substance sort of sits in a different place. It's less important. And here's the other thing: is there a certain types of substances that might make people feel in a certain way. So stimulants might make people feel a bit fight, flight, freezy, a bit kind of like that, and that's all to do with the amygdala. And so maybe doing an activity like I don't know, surfing or something where that kind of mimics a sort of an aspect of that could be a more constructive way of diverting someone. So there are lots of projects that use that. Safe spaces for young people. Some young people want to retreat to almost like a cave. In certain schools, you'll have certain zones for certain young people to be able to escape and just have that time out, and that's really, really important. So to allow young people to have that. And then that sense of future. So we talked about that before, hopes and aspirations. If someone has an aspiration, it's really, really helpful because it gives something to hang things on. And as you will all know, if you've had an aspiration, sometimes certain things don't fit with where that aspiration is. So it might be that drugs and alcohol do not fit to where your aspiration wants to go. So again, it's really, really helpful. So helping young people to cope, coping strategies, self-soothing, it's things that we take for granted sometimes, is how we self-soothe, how we regulate our own feelings and behaviors. And so in some cases, it's about helping young people to soothe as well, if their use is about self-soothe as well. Support or help from others. Always ask for help when you need to. You there are people out there who are wonderful and doing an amazing job, either in our organisation, Christie's organisation, or other non-drugs and alcohol things. There are always people who are willing to help, and sometimes it can feel horrible asking for help, and particularly as a parent or a carer, because you sort of sometimes can internalise that and go, well, they might be using drugs and alcohol because of me. But often people have their own choices and reasons, as we've discussed around that. Um, so yeah, and it's just that understanding. So parents getting and carers trying to understand the whole arena. You don't have to be experts, but sometimes it's just about asking. If a young person tells us about a substance, we will maybe internally worry, but externally we'll be asking those questions. So we'll be saying, so what does it look like? Where did you get it? Who were you with at the time? What effect did that give you? And what did you learn? So all of those kind of questions are all enabling. They're getting a young person to be able to say, this is my world and this is how it affected me. As a parent, we can so often come with this lens of don't do that, you must not do that, because we're risk averse. Because as parents, we don't want our children to be, unsafe. We don't want them to be putting themselves at risk. We certainly don't want them to come to any harm. And so, in some cases, parents can be sort of overbearing in that circumstance. But of course, with teenagers, developmentally, what happens is teenagers' friends suddenly become much more important than adults, and so we hope that we can get those foundations right. Then, if they do go into substance misuse, they're more than likely going to come out the other end of it, or we can, really support them. I'll talk about some other bits quickly. Oh God, there's so many slides. So what works in education? I've already talked about this. Spiral curriculum, for those who aren't aware, is basically the younger you are, so the older you are, the more you learn. So when you're in primary level, you might be learning about what's in the kitchen cupboards, things like solvents and stuff and stuff that immediately could be risky. And so you might be doing that. And then as you get older, you might introduce things. You might not talk about heroin to a 7-year-old at that point unless they've got a specific experience of that with a parent or carer who is misusing an opiate, in which case you might need a more specific approach around that. We run a project called the Y Project, which is our support of young people who are impacted on by parental or family member substance misuse. And so they don't have to be using themselves, the young people, but we work with them in a range of different ways to support them around that. Credible in, not using scare tactics. This is something that we used to do wholesale many years ago, which was the whole you're going to die, you're going to do this, this is going to be awful. And what we know is that young people look to legitimize a statement you've made with what they know and what's surrounding them. So if you're giving a statement like you're going to die, statistically you might be correct. However, they're going to look around themselves and go, well, this mate's doing this mate's doing this, they're doing this, and they're doing that. None of them are dead, so therefore you must be wrong. So it's actually what I'm saying is it's making the message more relevant to them and where they're at. Um, and if you don't know something, own it. There is nothing worse than trying to blag it with someone, because particularly in this modern day and age of the internet, there's lots of information out there. Young people can access a lot of different stuff. Some of it's false, but some of it is accurate. And if you're trying to make it up on the spot, a young person who's pretty savvy will absolutely pull that apart, and you could then illegitimize the information you're going. So therefore, if you don't know, use it as an experience to say, tell me about it. Why are you using it? What does it do to you? And how does it affect you? That is a much better approach to come in with a young person. And for some of our young people, they will just totally open up and go, well, I do this because of this and that. You might not like what they necessarily say, but at least that you're starting a conversation that's open and honest and caring. And it comes from a place of concern and worry and want them to make better choices and do better. And then
Simon, we've got a hand up.
Oh, yes, I can
We've
see.
we've got Chrissy with her hand up.
Hello, Chrissy.
You're on mute at the moment, Chrissy.
Technological.
Well, you're in my gang, so that's fine.
Linked to also what the lady said earlier on, is there a specific age? Because if you've got children who are that you're looking after in care,
Yeah.
who are parents have been users and still
Yeah.
probably are users, but they still have contact with them, is
Yes.
there an age? What is there extra support for them in sort of educating them in understanding? So there's more
Yes.
access, is it?
Yeah, so we do a project called the Y Project. So that's our work with young people who might not use substances themselves, but their parents or carers
How
or family
young are
members
they?
do. Well, we don't have a lower age bracket, but I would say for a
Right.
number of reasons, probably 6 is as
Right.
young as we could go. We have gone younger, but it's a different skill set. It's a very early years skill set, and it takes a very specific set of approaches for early years. And the other thing, we have to work with sort of where that young person's at. And some young people, I can remember working with one who was 8, and they said, we were talking about drugs in school, and I started talking about the stuff that my mum smokes, and the whole class went silent and everyone stared at me. And at that point, I realized that's not normal. So, so some young
Mm.
people have a developmental experience that's different than others, in which case the schools are actually getting really good at being able to identify them. But yeah, I would say anything under six is would be tricky. But at the same time, I would still invite a conversation about whether
Mm.
we could support them or whether we could refer them to an early years support to get that support. We
Yeah.
go up to 18, but we're also we do a thing called the transitions panel now with our adult colleagues. So we're looking at those who are 18 to 25, and maybe care experienced or such like that, and who would be the best to support them. So would they be best
Okay.
in adult services or young people's?
Mm.
So we have a
Thank you.
range of different
Yeah.
things, but I hope that's answered the
Thank
question.
you. Yes, it has. Yeah. Thank you.
No worries. Okay. So the NSPCC. So what do they say about what parents should do? And this is a thing that we often get a lot. What should I do? What do I do? I've got this drugs and alcohol in young person. So we have to be aware of potential risks, and then take those protective steps. But again, like the things I've already said, communicating openly, discussing risk of drug use with children, but in a way that's not judgmental. That's kind of I would use a lot of work of psychologist called Dan Hughes. He's sort of like behaviorist, and he does a lot of stuff with young people. And he talks about co-exploring with young people, getting alongside them. And as a human problem solver like myself, I'm desperate to get involved and try to problem solve. But sometimes it's about holding back from our want to problem solve and listening to what the actual reasons are, and then trying to sort of support. So modeling that healthy behavior. Now, obviously, that's challenging if you have addiction yourself, but we sometimes see that parents are that do what I say and not as I do, and young people are very good at picking that apart. Well, wait a minute, you're telling me not to drink, but last night you got brought home in a wheelie bin. Then it sort of starts to undermine that lesson. But it could be a moment for a discussion around how sometimes things can go a bit wrong, and then we have to learn by it. Monitoring their substance use, keep an eye on it, and then look at those changes. So, what changes? And that's the thing that I said right at the start. You know your young people, and you know when something changes, and it will enable you to then ask the question, what's causing that change? You might not know, but hopefully, if you make the young person feel safe and supported and trusted, to be able to discuss those things, you might be able to pick that out and see what extra support they need. Um, but absolutely come and seek support from ourselves, from Christie's organisation as well. We're there to help you as much as we are young people. And obviously, in the adult circumstance, they could refer young people to the Y Project whilst working with the adults. We've seen some really good models of that working really, really well. And it takes a bit of the heat off the parents as well, because we can then get alongside and work with those young people. And particularly, one of the things that young people have is self blame. So they'll have mum or dad has relapsed. They've gone back to their drug use, and that's my fault because I was playing up the other day, and that made my mum use drugs. So that sense of self-blame can be really powerful. So trying to remove that and say that, regardless of the scenario, people still make their own choice. And it is about, choice. And also treatment. Why can mum or dad just not stop? I want them to stop, but they won't do it. And that means they must not love me. So there's a whole set of assumptions that young people can often make around this. And that's what the Y Project was there for, to try to give them that roadmap, to try to say, okay, mum and dad might not be able to, be successful in treatment at this point. But if we can tell you how treatment works, if we can talk about addiction and what that looks like, if we can talk about that substance and what that looks like, and in some cases, if we can also give you the tools, I'm thinking things like naloxone, the tools where if a parent overdoses, or goes over, then that young person has a set of tools that they can help. We've taught young people first aid principles before, and they have been used when mum or dad has overdosed historically. So there's little bits and pieces we can do to try to make their situation better. Obviously, we've got safeguarding as well that overrules everything, and so we're not necessarily talking about that kind of that realm. So hopefully, if we put all of these different things and the alternatives, offering alternative different things to do, that then might help. Hidden harm I've alluded to, I've talked about, so I'm not going to really hang on this because we've totally run out of time and I've gone way, way over. But what we know about hidden harm is it's hidden because young people don't often talk or want to raise their head above the parapet to say, my mum and dad are using drugs and alcohol. Um, and so as a result, they hide it. They're also scared because they may have been told by parents, by others, they may have been told, well, if you say anything, then you're going to get taken away and social service will take you away. And then, and a young person loves their parents, but they don't necessarily love what their parents do. And so it can be a really challenging time for young people holding all that. There's often a palpable sense of relief in young people when they're able to say something, and then someone is going to accept that and just listen to that. So that can be really helpful. Doesn't necessarily have to be us. It can be others who hear as well and listen. But we know it causes problems right the way through, from early childhood right the way. There's some stuff by a person called Cleaver et al. I think it's 1999 that looks at hidden harm. So any of you who are a bit more academically minded, then you might want to have a look at Cleaver. And Cleaver looks at developmental ages and the impact of parental substance misuse on that. Okay. Now, as a service, we run a confidential service, much very similar to adult services, but we would use a framework. So we use Fraser Guidelines, Gillett Competencies to offer a confidential service. The reason why we offer a confidential service is because for some of our very, very vulnerable young people, they would not say anything to us or to anyone if we didn't. It has to be our start point, but underneath that is also that link to, we know that when parents are working well together and when families are working well together, we get better outcomes. So what we still need to do is encourage that communication. But in some cases, young people will say, if my parents know, I'm going to be at significant risk. So we have to weigh those things up. But what we will try and do is talk to parents wherever we possibly can about those bits. In some cases, parents just want to know that their young person is coming to us and attending sessions. They don't necessarily want to know all the nitty-gritty details of what has been talked about. So there is an element of negotiation that comes with confidentiality as well, around trying to see about what we can share, what we can't share, how can we advocate for that young person. So in some cases, we might go to meetings and advocate for them. Okay, so that's confidentiality. And then this is us, Why Smart. So have a look at our website, y-smart.org.uk. Have a look at that. We need updating it. It's a bit old now in many ways. We had a discussion yesterday actually about how we're going to reinvigorate it using younger people who are far better at tech than me and far more cool than I am, because I think I'm just becoming more tragic as I get older. So yeah. So have a look at that. It's got information. Our referral forms are within that. So we've either got a Why Smart referral form, which is for those young people who are using substances themselves, and then we've got a Why Project form, which is for those impacted on by parents or family member substance misuse. So that's those two. Christy, I don't know if you've talked about together whilst I was off.
No, not just yet, but I'm happy to give a quick little
Yeah, absolutely.
spiel about what we do. So
Go ahead.
this slide, the slide before is just about referral information, where we're based. So we've got 3 different Together services, 3 different hubs. So like I said, we've got the South and West hub, which is obviously Teignbridge, South Hams, West Devon. We then have the Exeter East and Mid hub, and then we have Barnstaple and North Devon as well. And if you go onto the website, you're able to sort of put where your location is and where the hub is closest to you. And I've popped there as well how to make a self-referral or how a loved one can make a referral if needed as well. And that can also be done online. So I've popped that in the chat. And then the next slide is just a little bit about what we do as a service, just sort of bullet pointed really. So the first thing is brief interventions, support, advice, signposting. Sometimes it's not actually our service that people want or need. And we're able to sort of signpost to where might be more suitable, or people might come into treatment with us and we give sort of support and advice throughout their treatment with us. We do a lot around harm reduction, and we also offer BBV testing. So we do Hep C testing, HIV testing, but we also offer Hep B vaccinations as well. We offer naloxone and
What's BBV?
train BBV,
That's
sorry,
bloodborne
bloodborne
virus.
viruses.
Oh,
So hepatitis, HIV, yeah, bloodborne viruses. Sorry, I forget sometimes about how many acronyms there are in the drug world. So yeah, naloxone provision. So we hand out naloxone to our service users, but we also train other agencies in how to administer naloxone. So naloxone is an opiate reverser. So if somebody does overdose on opiates, using naloxone, similar to an EpiPen, can help reverse the effects of opiate use. So you'll see the police carrying around naloxone now. All ambulance crews will carry naloxone round, but you'll also find sort of housing support and even security services within sort of South and West Devon, sort of on the streets will know how to use naloxone, at least if somebody's got it on their person. We offer psychosocial support for adults over 18, and that includes one-to-one work, group work, peer support and mutual aid, such as smart recovery, holistic support, so things out of the realms of sort of just sitting in a room and talking, or sitting in a group. We have something called Flourish in Nature, which is where we do a lot of sort of like arts and crafts, nature-based activities. In the summer, it's really lovely what we are able to do when the weather's a little bit better. So we have a whole community development team that support with putting those things on. And we also offer family support as well. So we have a family worker based in each of the teams. So if parents are using substances and they do have children, they will get allocated to the family worker. So they get that little bit more sort of specific support. We have a criminal justice team, and it's huge now. It used to be very, very small, but we now have a very large criminal justice team. So we do a lot of work around prison releases, criminal justice orders that come through the courts, and a lot of that transition style work. We do opiate substitution therapy, so OST prescribing. So that's for opiate service users that go on to methadone or buprenorphine prescriptions. And that's all managed by our prescribing team in-house. And then we also offer community detoxes for alcohol clients as well. So a medicated alcohol detox. Alongside that, we do also offer inpatient detox and rehab support as well. We have healthcare assistants within each of our hubs. So we offer health and wellbeing assessments when people come into treatment, but also throughout treatment if it's required as well. And we can look at sort of advice and harm minimization as well, in ensuring people are as healthy as possible. And then really new to the service, we now offer employment support. So as of the beginning of January, we now offer something called IPS, which is employment support for people engaging with Together Drug and Alcohol Service. So we've got employment specialists in all three of the hubs now, and recovery workers can refer people